Somewhere inside a Microsoft Office right now, there is a piece of software running on a server that would have gotten an employee fired 20 years ago, because the man who used to run this company once stood on a stage in front of the entire world and called this exact technology a cancer, a threat, an enemy, to be stopped at all costs. And yet, here we are in the summer of 2026. And that same company just built it, packaged it, put its own name on it, and gave it away for free. And if you think that sentence sounds small, stay with me for the next few minutes, because I promise you, by the end of this video, you will understand why some of the sharpest people in the tech industry are calling this the quietest, strangest, most consequential thing Microsoft has done in a decade. And almost nobody outside of a small circle of engineers even noticed it happen. On June 2nd, 2026, at Microsoft's Build Conference, in front of thousands of developers who had no idea what they were about to witness, Microsoft released its own Linux distribution to the public. And I need you to sit with that for a second, because this is not a partnership. This is not a licensing deal with Red Hat. This is not Microsoft quietly buying its way into someone else's ecosystem. This is Microsoft building an entire operating system from the ground up. Based on Fedora, one of the most technically serious and respected Linux projects in existence, and shipping it under the name Azure Linux 4.0. And if you had walked up to someone during the Windows XP era, back when Microsoft's own executives were comparing open source software to a disease, and told them that one day Microsoft would build and give away a free Linux operating system with its own name stamped on the box, they would have laughed you out of the building. But here it is, real, downloadable, and already running on production infrastructure around the planet. Now here is where the story actually begins, because Azure Linux did not appear out of nowhere in 2026. It has a secret history, one that stretches back to 2020, when Microsoft quietly built something called CBL Mariner, a lightweight Linux system meant purely to run behind the scenes, powering Microsoft's own cloud machinery and edge devices without a single customer ever being told it existed, a hidden engine humming away inside the walls of Azure while the public-facing story stayed the same, Windows, Windows, Windows. And in 2023, Microsoft rebranded that quiet internal tool as Azure Linux, but it still lived mostly in the shadows, a backstage tool, not something regular developers or businesses were ever meant to touch. And that is exactly what makes this year so different. Because in mid-May 2026, at the Open Source Summit North America in Minneapolis, Microsoft did something it had never done before. It stood up in front of the open source world and formally announced Azure Linux 4.0, not as an internal utility this time, but according to Microsoft's own corporate vice president for Azure Cloud Native, Brendan Burns, the actual co-founder of Kubernetes himself, as a genuine bet on open source as the foundation for the entire AI era. And then just a few weeks later, on June 2nd at Build 2026, Microsoft pushed Azure Linux 4.0 into public preview, making it available on Azure virtual machines, on Kubernetes through AKS, and shortly after, through its own dedicated Windows subsystem for Linux distribution. And then, in a move that genuinely stunned longtime open source watchers, Microsoft went even further, because on July 1st, 2026, just weeks before this video, Microsoft made Azure Linux 4 downloadable as a standalone ISO file directly from its GitHub page, meaning for the very first time in the company's history, you do not need an Azure account. You do not need a cloud subscription. You do not need to give Microsoft a single dollar or a single piece of billing information. You can simply download it and run it on your own machine like any other Linux distribution on Earth. And if that sounds like a small technical detail to you, it is not, because this is the first time Microsoft has ever offered a fully supported general purpose Linux server operating system to the public that exists completely outside the walls of its own cloud empire. And once you understand why that matters, the rest of this story starts to click into place like pieces of a puzzle you did not know you were holding. Because here's the part that should genuinely make you pay attention. Azure Linux 4.0 is not some stripped-down toy project built to generate a headline. It is built on Fedora, the same serious, technically rigorous upstream project that eventually feeds directly into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And that is not an accident. That is a calculated decision. Because when Amazon built Amazon Linux, they built it completely from scratch, isolated from any major community distribution, an island of their own making. But Microsoft chose a different path entirely, aligning itself directly with the Fedora and Red Hat ecosystem, betting on collaboration with the existing open source world instead of building another walled garden. And there is something almost poetic buried inside that decision, because Microsoft, the very last of the three major hyperscalers, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, to finally ship a full general purpose server Linux distribution of its own, is now the company most publicly bowing to the open source world it once tried to destroy. And alongside Azure Linux 4.0, Microsoft also quietly released a second product, Azure Container Linux, built on the acquired Flatcar Container Linux project, and, now generally available, an immutable operating system, meaning it ships as a read-only image where you cannot install packages or change settings while the system is running. And instead, when updates arrive, the entire operating system image gets swapped out cleanly, a security and reliability model borrowed directly from how modern container-first infrastructure is supposed to work. And together, these two releases mark the single most aggressive expansion of Microsoft's Linux ambitions in the company's entire history, and the timing of all of this, arriving right in the middle of the biggest infrastructure arms race the tech industry has ever seen, is not a coincidence. It is a calculated bet on exactly where the next decade of computing is heading, and that brings us to the real question, the one every serious person in this industry is quietly asking right now. Why would Microsoft, a company that built an entire empire on Windows licensing revenue, suddenly pour serious engineering resources into giving away a competing operating system for free? And to understand the answer, you have to understand something Microsoft itself has now openly admitted, something that would have been unthinkable to say out loud 15 years ago. Because according to Microsoft's own published figures, more than 2/3 of the customer computing cores running on Azure today are running Linux, not Windows. Read that again, on Microsoft's own cloud platform, built by the company that once treated Windows as sacred ground. Linux is not the minority operating system anymore. It is the dominant one, and it does not stop there, because Microsoft has now confirmed publicly that its own flagship products, Microsoft 365, GitHub, and even OpenAI's ChatGPT infrastructure, all sit on Linux foundations at some level of their stack. This is not a leak. This is not a rumor whispered on some forum. This is Microsoft's own public messaging in 2026. And when you step back and look at the full shape of this story, Azure Linux stops looking like a sudden decision made this year and starts looking like the inevitable conclusion of a trend that has been quietly building for almost a decade. Ever since Satya Nadella began steering Microsoft toward embracing open source instead of fighting it, starting with Visual Studio Code, the acquisition of GitHub itself back in 2018, and the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which let Windows users run a real Linux environment without ever leaving their desktop. And Azure Linux is simply the next and arguably the most important chapter of that same strategy playing out in real time in front of us. But there's another layer to this story that most casual tech coverage is completely missing, because this entire release is happening in the middle of the biggest infrastructure arms race in the history of computing, the race to build and scale artificial intelligence systems. And Brendan Burns said it plainly at that open source summit in Minneapolis. Open source, he said, is the foundation for AI, and as AI workloads scale, developers need that foundation to be more secure, more predictable, and easier to build apps and agents on top of. And that single quote tells you almost everything you need to know about why this is happening right now and not 5 years ago, because the massive GPU clusters powering large language models run overwhelmingly on Linux. Every major AI lab, every cloud provider, every serious machine learning pipeline on Earth is built on Linux containers, Linux kernels, and Linux orchestration tools like Kubernetes. And if Microsoft wanted to remain competitive in the AI infrastructure race against Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud, both of which already had their own hardened, purpose-built Linux distributions in Amazon Linux and Google's container-optimized OS, then Microsoft simply could not afford to keep relying on a patchwork of third-party Linux systems running on its own cloud. It needed full first-party control over the operating system underneath its own AI infrastructure, control over the security patching schedule, control over the update cycle, control over compliance certifications. And that is precisely what Azure Linux 4.0 and Azure Container Linux now give the company. And this is where the story gets even more strategically interesting, because Microsoft has not stopped at simply releasing a free public preview. According to reporting from Directions on Microsoft, the company is actively working to turn Azure Linux into a full commercial distribution, something businesses and partners can build entire products around, not just something Microsoft quietly uses behind the scenes, which is a completely different level of commitment, meaning dedicated long-term support cycles, enterprise-grade service level agreements, and the exact kind of paid support contracts that companies like Red Hat have built entire billion-dollar businesses on for decades. Microsoft is not dipping a toe into the Linux world anymore. It is preparing to compete directly in the same enterprise Linux support market that Red Hat and SUSE have dominated for years. But there is an important caveat that responsible reporting has to include here, because right now Azure Linux 4.0 is still officially in public preview, and it is not yet a complete drop-in replacement for certified enterprise distributions. And according to Windows Latest's coverage from late June 2026, FIPS 143 certification, the federal security standard required for government, financial services, and healthcare workloads, is still in progress and will not be finalized until Azure Linux reaches full general availability, which Microsoft expects sometime later in 2026. So if you work in a regulated industry that legally requires a FIPS certified operating system, Azure Linux is not yet ready to replace your certified Red Hat Enterprise Linux deployment, but the direction of travel is unmistakable, and it is only a matter of months before that gap closes for good. And so let's bring this back to the question that actually matters to you, the person watching this right now, whether you're a developer, an IT professional, a small business owner, or simply someone who has used Windows your entire life and is wondering what any of this has to do with you. Does Microsoft building its own Linux distribution mean Windows is somehow in danger? Does it mean your desktop computer is about to change overnight? Or is this purely a cloud story with nothing to do with the machine sitting on your desk right now? And the honest answer is more complicated and honestly more fascinating than most headlines are giving it credit for. Because no, Windows is not disappearing tomorrow. And no, Microsoft is not secretly planning to abandon the operating system that still generates billions of dollars in licensing revenue every single year. But if you think this story has nothing to do with your daily experience, you are missing the more subtle, more important part of what is actually happening here. And the clearest connection point is the Windows Subsystem for Linux, better known as WSL, which Microsoft first introduced back in 2016 and has continued expanding ever since, and according to reporting from Windows Latest, also with generous support and with a genuinely open development model built on Fedora, and that is fantastic in the short term. But history has taught this industry a repeated, painful lesson about companies that offer free, deeply integrated infrastructure early on, only to gradually shift pricing, support terms, or default configurations once adoption becomes widespread enough that switching away becomes genuinely painful. And this is sometimes called strategic lock-in, and it does not require any malicious intent to happen. It can simply be the natural result of a company building an ecosystem so convenient and so deeply woven into your existing Azure workflow that leaving it later becomes a real engineering and financial burden. And if your entire AI infrastructure, your container orchestration, your virtual machine fleet, and your developers' WSL environments are all quietly standardized around Azure Linux, you have effectively made a long-term bet on Microsoft's roadmap, pricing decisions, and support. Priorities, even if you never explicitly signed a contract saying so, and that is not a reason to avoid Azure Linux entirely, but it is a consideration that deserves far more attention than it is currently getting in the coverage of this release. And the FIPS 143 certification gap we talked about earlier is another underreported risk worth repeating clearly, because it has real financial consequences. If you work in banking, healthcare, defense, or any government-adjacent industry in the United States, moving production workloads onto Azure Linux 4.0 before that certification is finalized could expose your organization to compliance failures during an audit, and Microsoft has said it expects to close that gap before Azure Linux reaches full general availability later in 2026. But expectations and finalized certifications are not the same thing, and any organization operating in a regulated industry should treat the current public preview status as exactly that, a preview, not a production-ready foundation, until Microsoft formally confirms otherwise. And so what should you actually do with all of this information, whether you're a developer, an IT decision maker, or simply someone who follows tech news? Because these shifts genuinely fascinate you, the practical takeaway here is straightforward. If you're curious, download the Azure Linux 4.0 ISO from Microsoft's GitHub page and test it in a local virtual machine, completely free, completely outside of any Azure billing account, and see for yourself how it compares to the Fedora or Red Hat systems you may already be running. And if you're managing production infrastructure, treat Azure Linux as a distribution to evaluate and pilot on non-critical workloads over the coming months, not something to migrate your entire compliance-sensitive infrastructure onto immediately. And if you're simply a Windows user who has never touched Linux in your life, know that the most likely place you will personally encounter Azure Linux is through an upcoming WSL distribution option, quietly sitting inside your own Windows machine, letting you run real Linux tooling without ever installing a second operating system and stepping back from every technical detail we've covered. What this story really represents is something much bigger than one company's product announcement. It is a symbol of how completely the technology industry has been reshaped by the demands of cloud computing and artificial intelligence over the past decade, because the old operating system wars, Windows versus Mac, Windows versus Linux, fought over who controlled the desktop of the average consumer, feel almost quaint now compared to what is actually being fought over today, which is who controls the invisible infrastructure running underneath the AI systems quietly reshaping every industry on Earth. And Microsoft spent 30 years building an empire on the idea that one, operating system could rule every device you touch. And in 2026, that very same company is publicly admitting that the future of computing is layered, plural, and built on open foundations, even when that means quietly competing against its own legacy product. And that is not a small shift. That is a company rewriting its own identity in real time, in full public view, and most people simply have not noticed yet. So now I want to ask you directly, do you think this is a genuine shift in Microsoft's strategy? Or just a defensive move to stay competitive with Amazon and Google in the AI infrastructure race? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and if this video helped you understand what's actually happening behind the headlines, subscribe, because we cover these kinds of under-the-radar tech and geopolitical shifts before they ever become mainstream news. And if you found this useful, send it to someone who still thinks Windows and Linux are simply enemies, because as of the summer of 2026, that war quietly ended, and almost nobody said goodbye.